Welcome to Daddy's Podcast.
This is the Redefining Plastics Podcast. This one's going to be a little bit different today, kind of similar to one we've done in the past, where I went through, watched some videos, made comments, and just kind of reacted, very similar to a reaction video that you'll see on whatever, YouTube, Instagram. We're going to look at some anti-plastics videos and see what they get right, see what they get wrong, and then just have a discussion about it. Before we get into all that, a little bit of the elephant in the room. Obviously, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you saw my post that my wife of 8 years and best friend of 20 passed on the 13th of February. She was the best part of this household, and our girls and I miss her desperately. But at the same time, we really, really appreciate all of the support that we're receiving from strangers in some cases. And there's so many people to thank that I couldn't even go through the list today. But we know that we're loved. We know that this community and this plastics industry looks out for its own. And I really do appreciate everything that everybody's done for me and for this family so far. And really looking forward to the rest of the year. I know she would want us to keep going. For those that don't know, she battled with an illness for about 7 months. She'd been in and out of the hospital for a long time. And so we had some time to prepare for the eventuality, but it did not make it any easier. And grief is a weird thing, I got to say, for anybody that's experienced it in the past in any meaningful way. It comes in waves. There are certain days where things are much harder than others, but I'd say for the most part, hanging around my girls and talking to people have made things easier. So for me, I'm going to keep on doing the podcast. I'm going to keep pushing forward, because I really do feel like this is a way for me to interact with people outside of my typical sphere. So really looking forward to having further conversations. It appears to me, and would love to hear feedback, comments, or any other emails or LinkedIn messages, what you all would be interested in seeing. But it, to me, seems like the episodes that are doing the best are the ones that are talking about recycling and the different people that are involved in recycling and growing recycling. The others are more topical. We'll call them more legislative advocacy based, which I'm also passionate about. So I'm fine with doing either of those. But yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know what you're interested in. We'll do more of those as we go forward. But like I said, thank you to everybody. And thank you to this community and to those that have been following along with the podcast, and those that maybe I don't see as much as I'd like, but really appreciate everything that you all have done for me since the tough news on the 13th of February. So thanks so much. Right now we're going to go through, I think I've got a list of about 7 or 8 different YouTube videos that I have saved on my watch later. So we'll go through each of those, kind of roll along with it. We'll see what we think, and would love to have conversation also in the comments or whatever about these videos. What do you think? What are your thoughts? Would like to have more of a discussion on this. So here we go.
The last half of the 20th century saw a boom in plastic manufacturing and a growing waste problem. To address this issue, municipal and state recycling programs emerged across the U.S.
I guess it's important to mention that this is a PBS video, How Big Business Broke Recycling and Blamed You. So this right off the bat caught my attention, because this seems to be the big talking point of recycling doesn't work and we need to stop trying to recycle our way out of it. I see that phrase a lot. We can't recycle our way out of it. And I don't think anybody's saying that we're going to recycle our way out of waste issues globally. Nobody's talking about that. But at the same time, I would love to see a lot more recycling. I know recycling works, as we've talked about ad nauseum on this podcast, but we need more than just recycling, right? We need to reduce, we need to reuse where we can, but recycling works and we need to do more of it. And I'm passionate about it, and I'm going to continue to be passionate about it. And I think these kind of videos, if this goes the direction that I think it's going to go, are counterproductive. So we'll see.
People reject now the philosophy of the throwaway society.
Today, we sift and sort our waste into separate bins with the promise that our cans, water bottles,
Ecologists.
cardboard, and even electronics will be taken apart and turned into brand new items, reducing waste and the resources used to make things. But there's a problem with this emphasis on recycling as a solution to our excessive waste. For one, most of the stuff we put in our recycling bins doesn't get recycled. And here's the bigger issue.
Well, I think most of the stuff that most Americans put in recycling bins, people are putting batteries. I saw somebody put a printer in one of the recycling bins. Of course, that stuff's not going to get recycled. That's ridiculous. People don't take the time to check and see what's accepted in their area, and they just start dumping stuff into the recycle bin. And then we get pissed off when these things aren't recycled. Yeah, of course they're not going to get recycled. Nobody's going to recycle anything that comes in with lithium ion batteries. It's going to explode. There's going to be a fire. It makes no sense. I think I know where this thing's going to go. I'm going to let it play a little bit longer. We'll see what it has to say.
Recycling shifts the burden of waste onto us as individual consumers and absolves companies of responsibility for what.
So, and there's another thing. I think the plastics industry supports EPR. I've talked about this before. As long as it's an even playing field, everybody plays by the same rules. There's no bans or anything like that. Yeah, we agree, and we should do that. But when people say that this plastic waste, we're shifting the blame to the consumer, and we are not, as an industry, holding up our end of the bargain. I just think that's a false narrative. It's a false story, because really, people are buying this stuff. People are buying the packaging. They're showing water bottles right here. People buy billions of water bottles a year. Some of that stuff's going to end up in the environment because people just chuck them out of their car. In third world countries or island nations that don't have any kind of waste system, that stuff's going to get chucked too, more than likely ending up in the ocean, and then ends up back on their beaches. People are responsible for that. As a consumer, I'm responsible for everything that I purchase. Every single package that comes into this house was a decision made by me. And if that stuff is not properly disposed of, that's my fault. It's not the company's fault. There have been multiple lawsuits in New York. The New York Attorney General tried to sue Pepsi because they were a major polluter, because they went and walked around and found chip bags and soda cans and all of this stuff just floating in this river in New York. And they tried to sue Pepsi. The judge rightly threw that out because Pepsi didn't chuck that stuff into the stream. People did. People are not taking care of this. And if you make the choice to buy a water bottle and you're not putting it in the recycle bin, that's on you. That's not on systems, government. It's not on companies. That's on you. And that, I think what's interesting is the whole premise of this video is that companies are blaming people. And I don't think I've heard, outside of me, any company come out and say that people are doing this. And this is just my personal opinion because I am passionate about this, and it pisses me off that people aren't making the right choices. Nobody's going around saying that people are responsible for all waste. You know what? We have a hand in it as well. We produce stuff. We need to make sure that it's produced in a way that it can be recycled. All right, we'll take that. But I think the situation is Americans, for the most part, don't like responsibility. I may be wrong on that, But I think people don't like responsibility. They make decisions and they want somebody else to fix it. They bring in a bunch of trash. They bring in fast fashion. They want it to be resolved by somebody else, not them. It is everyone's responsibility to take ownership of everything that they consume. You are the consumer. You have to take responsibility for it. Stop blaming companies for
What they
it. It's
produce.
ridiculous.
This wasn't by chance. Since the 1950s, companies have campaigned fiercely to increase plastic production.
Because it's
Coca-Cola,
lighter,
new 1 liter plastic
better
bottle,
carbon
25%
footprint,
lighter than glass.
While
and
framing
it doesn't
consumers
break.
as both the problem and the solution to waste.
So come on, America. Next time you see someone polluting, point it out. People start pollution. People can stop it.
True. Bad ad campaign, but a true
From
statement.
the raw materials of nature has been synthesized a new material, a resin made by man, plastic.
When you toss a plastic yogurt cup in a recycling bin, the odds of transforming it into a new product are very low. Of the 8.3 billion tons of plastic generated since the 1950s, only about 9% has been recycled.
This is
About
another
12%.
false equivalent. I get so sick of seeing this. That is total production of plastics. There are durable goods in there. There are cars, it's planes, everything else. This isn't apples to apples. Total production of packaging made out of plastics to what's recycled. So we need to really challenge these kind of narratives when we see them, because it's not fact. It's not fact-based. We would love to recycle more. We need EPR in some cases to make that happen. We need infrastructure. We need companies like Brave right here that are out there putting these connections together. I saw Bailey from Madium the other day challenging people on LinkedIn, saying that we have the feedstock available. We're just not connecting it to the right end users. We need to do that. We need to, as an industry, fix those problems. But we also need more than 43% of Americans to recycle. Once again, personal responsibility. If you're going to buy the product, make sure that you're handling it in the right way.
Was incinerated, while the rest accumulated in landfills and dumps or in the environment. There are hundreds of types of plastic products with different polymers and components.
Different substances and
Polymers.
combinations being used to
Interesting
produce
way of saying
plastic
that.
with different properties for varied uses.
To sort it all and turn it into new material is expensive and technologically challenging. Companies have found it's cheaper to just produce new plastic. Most of what does
We found it's cheaper to produce new anything. It's cheaper to produce new paper. It's cheaper to produce new glass. It's cheaper because you've got the system. There's a whole supply chain that's been established. In plastics, as an example, you are bringing stuff through pipelines for the most part. So a lot of plastics made in the U.S. are made from natural gas. Not a lot of crude oil being cracked. It depends on markets, but for the most part, are the beneficial markets that we have here for natural gas make natural gas or light cracking more efficient here. So we have pipelines that are established. You're moving this material over huge distances, and it's not in a truck. And so when you go from that pipelines to a cracker, then through another pipeline to a polymer site, to managing recycled material where you're picking up a curbside bin at every single house, and then you're taking that to one facility, a MRF, and then sorting it there, and then taking it from there in bales to another facility to make back into plastics. Of course, that's going to be more expensive. Anybody who doesn't understand that and says these things like, we just figured this out, is almost the way that they're talking about it. We knew this from the beginning. Everybody knew that recycling was going to be more expensive, but it's the right thing to do. And that's why we're going to continue pushing to do it, because we want to reuse the materials that are already in the economy. It's just such a stupid argument, for a lack of a better way of saying it, that we can't. It's cheaper to do it the other way, so we're not going to use recycled materials. Yeah. And if people don't want to pay for the recycled materials, this is never going to work. It's never going to work for anything. So we probably need some sort of legislation, which I hate because I am a free market capitalist by nature, but you probably do need to have something that's going to spur that market. You're going to have some sort of recycled content or something to that nature, to that effect, to make this thing work.
Get recycled gets downgraded into products that can't be recycled again.
Recycled plastic is more expensive. On top of that, the quality decreases the more often it gets recycled. It becomes less heat resistant and tears more easily.
For decades, American recycling facilities shipped much of the plastic waste to China until it stopped accepting U.S. waste in 2018.
China has introduced new restrictions on the import of foreign waste. The flow of plastic waste from wealthy nations around the world is proving too much to handle.
A growing trend to address the massive plastic waste problem has been to replace our plastic goods with recycled aluminum and paper ones.
For plastic-free environment. That's right.
Aluminum recycles effectively with lower emissions than generated during its production. And almost 75% of aluminum ever created remains in use today. But addressing the problem...
See, I don't know how that's true. Because if you look at recycle rates for aluminum today, we're at the lowest point for recycling in the last several decades of aluminum. I think a study I saw recently was like 43% of aluminum cans were recycled. So I'm not entirely sure where they're getting these stats. And that's the other thing with these kind of videos is you really can't fact check unless they've got in there exactly where they're pulling this data from.
Of excess plastic with aluminum or paper
and I have nothing
creates
against
a new
aluminum,
problem.
by the way.
A high demand that can tip a sustainable production method into an unsustainable one, especially since producing a single new aluminum can emits twice as much greenhouse gas as a new plastic bottle.
Yeah.
So if recycling isn't working, why do cities and counties continue to tout it as a solution to the growing waste problem? Until the 1950s, Americans relied on reusable packaging, such as glass bottles, which had a nearly 96% return rate. With the rise of mass-produced plastics as the cheapest packaging alternative, reusable containers were crowded out. By the 1970s,
I think
the rate for all container...
I don't think anybody in America today really wants the milkman to come back. Can we be honest with each other? Is anybody in America comfortable with cleaning their own bottles, returning those, and then having milk delivered to your house? I'm not. And I'm a big proponent of reuse systems. But in this case, I think it's a faulty argument. The other issue with glass is it breaks. It breaks a lot. And there's a reason why in a household like I have, when I have multiple little kids running around here that occasionally get into the fridge and start pulling stuff out, I don't really want to have glass in my fridge because that's easily going to break. Glass is great for some things, but it's really not recycled in the U.S. in any significant way because it's expensive to do. It takes a ton of energy to do it, and you got to ship it long distances. For the most part, it goes back into asphalt. And that's the kind of argumentation that when people talk about plastics, they say, well, it's downcycled. It goes into park benches. How's that any different than this glass going into asphalt or aggregate? It's the same thing. And recycling is recycling. If it goes into a durable good that's going to be there for decades, what is the problem with that? Can somebody explain that to me? I would love, if somebody's got a comment on that, please send it my way because I have no issue with it. And I would love to have somebody explain to me why that's an issue.
Returns had dropped below 5%. Why a V in the dustbin? The decades since saw an unmanageable pileup of waste in landfills, which prompted a public outcry.
Yeah, because people got lazy.
New York City instituted a tax on plastic bottles in 1971. Congress debated a ban on all non-returnable containers in 1973. and the state of Hawaii banned plastic bottles in 1977.
In a highly controversial action, one county in New York State has voted to ban all packaging made of two kinds of plastic.
A loose alignment of oil, beverage, and packaging companies, along with the Society of the Plastics Industry, fought and lobbied against these measures. Their efforts managed to strike down Hawaii's plastic ban and the New York state tax, and ended the ban on non-returnable containers. At the same time, starting in the early 1970s, these companies launched marketing campaigns to change public perception of who was responsible for plastics waste.
People start
This
pollution.
commercial is just the
People
worst.
can stop it.
The concept of recycling was key to those efforts.
Make all America Sparkle City. Glitter in its place.
Large-scale recycling campaigns and nonprofits like Keep America Beautiful, funded by Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dow Chemical, and Mobil, shifted the blame of waste from the product's production to the end user. The problem became about what an individual consumer did with plastic after buying it, rather than about the creation of plastic products in the first place. In
What are you gonna
1971,
do?
the
It's-
Coca-Cola
All
bottling
right. So this stuff just it enrages me to no end. Yeah. Okay. What is the alternative? If you put glass, not everybody's recycling glass, and it's not recycled in the U.S. Like I just mentioned, 43% recycle rate, or it's 40, maybe it was 45%. I don't have it right in front of me for aluminum cans right now. Aluminum not getting back into the system is not a great thing. I think everybody would agree with that. Any of these packages not making its way back. 43% of Americans with access to recycling actually recycle. So let's say we ban plastics tomorrow. What else are we going to hold Cokes in? Is it all going to go back to bottles, glass bottles? Because that's a ton of CO2 emissions shipping that stuff across the country. There's a reason why we went to plastics. It doesn't break, and it is lighter and is more fuel efficient to move things around the country. So we can do this. By all means, let's do this. I don't think anybody's thinking about the replacement package in these discussions, and that pisses me off.
Company funded some of the world's earliest depots for recycling household waste, such as glass and aluminum in New York City. In 1988, the Society of the Plastics Industry funded the Council for Solid Waste Solutions to promote plastic recycling in cities, claiming that they could recycle 25% of plastic bottles by 1995. In 1989, Amoco, Mobil, and Dow formed the National Polystyrene Recycling Company, which made the same claim but for food packaging.
Well, we recognize that certainly the landfill problems are existing, and they're growing. We want to make sure that we've established this aggressive goal of 25% so that we will be able to recycle more of the products.
Polystyrene McDonald's hamburger containers are being recycled by a subsidiary of Amoco. They're just one of several companies joining America's recycling craze. Some, it seems, to improve their image.
The actual financial and logistical responsibility to build recycling infrastructure fell on municipalities and
That's what
taxpayers
EPR is going to fix.
instead of the companies that promised its efficacy.
The industry attitude was, we'll set this up and get it going. But if the public wants it, they are going to have to pay for it.
The corporate emphasis on recycling continues today. Exxon started funding the Recycling Partnership in 2018 and helped launch the Alliance to End Plastic Waste in
What kind of problem with the
2019.
recycling
As a global
partnership?
manufacturer with a global customer base, we want to address this global problem of plastic waste, and we're looking to
Recycling
scale up
partnership
that
has done nothing
activity
to
as
anybody
quickly as
other
we can.
than
Meanwhile,
provide
Exxon and other
curbside bins to a multitude of people, and they do great work, and they are not necessarily even an industry group. I'd say they're pretty much a free entity. It's a third party, if you will. And so I just think it's ridiculous to attack these people, because I think they do great stuff, and I would love to see them get more funding from the industry. And so that way they can get more recycle bins out to people and educate people and make sure that they're actually participating in. Because it's not just plastics that they're working to get more recycling done with. Paper and glass and aluminum all go in there. And if the plastics industry is supporting this system, what the heck's the problem with that? That just
Oil companies
false
continue
outrage,
to
and it
ramp
pisses
up
me off.
plastic production as the use for fossil fuels for energy falls out of favor. Plastics, which use fossil fuels for every step of their production, are set to overtake coal plant emissions by 2030. In the last
Okay, that last statement is just asinine. Coal is shrinking exponentially in the U.S. Of course, there's not going to be as much emissions coming out of a coal plant because there aren't that many coal plants anymore. It's insane. It's so stupid.
20 years, the plastics lobby has persuaded the majority of states to require the recycling symbol on all plastics, whether they're recyclable or not.
The plastics industry went around to states, and they did this very quietly, and they convinced those states to pass laws that required that symbol with the number on it be put on plastic containers sold in that state.
Any product can display the sign even if you can't recycle it.
These companies have known for decades that plastics are extremely difficult to recycle, but pushed it as an environmental solution anyway.
The average person saw the symbol and said, it says it's
Yeah, we gotta
recyclable right
educate
on
better.
it.
No getting around it.
question
If the
there.
public thinks
I
the
think they got a point
recycling
there.
is working, then they're not going to be as concerned about the environment.
So if individuals
Yeah, guys
sorting
in
out
the
the
70s
recycling
and
in their
80s said some
kitchens
stupid
isn't the
crap.
solution to our waste problem,
What else is new?
what is?
It is a new year and a new law in Bayonne, a ban on single-use plastic bags and plastic straws.
It's widespread regulation.
The plastic bag bans have led to a reciprocal huge increase of plastic consumption in bag manufacturing for groceries every single time it's been put into place. And California finally figured that out and banned plastic altogether. But now we've just got more thin gauge paper, which is not very highly recycled either, which is just going to lead to more deforestation long term. Because if we go from plastics to paper and the recycle rate stays where it's at, we're going to be doing a lot more virgin paper. I don't think anybody's thinking about that. Nobody's talking about that. The acidification, the nasty chemicals that go into paper. I've worked for several paper companies. I like paper. No problem with it. I have a problem when they use this kind of crap to their advantage and they start twisting things and making plastics look even worse because it's good marketing and it's an easy way to make extra money.
Of the plastics industry and banning single-use materials.
California, one step closer to banning recycling symbols on things that aren't recyclable.
Single-use plastic bags are banned across New York State.
His office has already subpoenaed ExxonMobil.
40%
Abanta
increase
says
in
oil
plastics
and petrochemical executives have
after
known
that
since the 1980s that the vast majority of plastics cannot be recycled.
We need to shift our focus away from what happens to your yogurt cup after it's been thrown away and look at how and why it was made in the first place. From how our products are made and
I
packaged
really like the
to rules that
1980s
reduce everyone's plastic
dramatic
use.
music in the background. Well, that was fun. First one out of the chute, and I'm already riled up. So we'll see how the rest of these go, but not really looking forward to this. I'm interested in this one. Business Insider. You're being lied to about ocean plastic. No clue where this is going to go, but it should be interesting.
About ocean plastic, it's usually in the context of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The idea that there was this giant trash island in the ocean was one of the things that got so many people paying attention to ocean plastic in the first place. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is in the open ocean. You cannot see land anywhere nearby. So when you see pictures like this, where there's clearly mountains or maybe islands in the background, that is obviously not the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And then when you start looking, you see that the majority of these are fake. Most of these are probably honest mistakes, but then there are other ones which are obviously photoshopped, like this one, which is clearly just using a picture of a landfill or something. The question here is, what does this thing actually look like if it doesn't look like any of this? And why is everyone using photos of it that are of something else? These photos are just one example of all the things we get wrong when we talk about the patch and about ocean plastic in general. The plastic isn't coming from where you think. We're blaming the wrong people for it. And there are devastating sources of microplastics that hardly anyone is even talking about. I've spent the last few months diving into the research and interviewing experts, and I'm here to tell you that you're being lied to about ocean plastic.
This is interesting.
So what does it actually look like?
Probably not going to work out in the way I want
short,
it to.
news
but
sites
we'll see.
and blogs use fake photos because the real thing just isn't that exciting to look at. It's this giant swirling vortex of plastic. It thins out at the edges. It moves every year, and plastic is constantly being added to it. It was talked about as another shame on us kind of thing, and it was assumed that it must be all of our daily household plastic that was in the garbage patch.
It's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It's mostly plastic, pulling what we all
As
throw
they
away.
dump out a
Basically,
bunch
the
of
framing
glass.
was like, we've all been bad, and now there's this big patch here. A study from 2022 looked at the macroplastics, the stuff bigger than 5 millimeters in the garbage patch, and found that 75 up to 86% of it was from the fishing industry.
Okay.
I think a lot of news coverage probably.
I think that Dr. Christy Arment hammers on this one a lot. I know he doesn't always rub people the right way, but I think he's a good dude that's trying to get people to look at these things from a different perspective. And I'm a big fan of what he's saying and what he's doing. And his message has always been, all of this stuff that's floating in the ocean is mostly nets and different things that are thrown overboard by boats. And so they just said 75 to 85% of the plastic that's in that garbage patch is from the fishing industry, which once again kind of rings true with everything that Dr. DeArment's saying. So it's interesting. We'll see how this goes.
Thought there was no harm in laying on a little bit of guilt about plastic because we all do buy and use it every day. But guilt mongering like that can still be dishonest, and making people feel defeated does not help. We've been doing that for a while now, and it has not addressed the plastic pollution crisis. When I first started talking to experts about this, I encountered one thing I really was not expecting. There's actually a debate going on over whether we should clean this thing up at all.
Once it is in the ocean, it is connected with marine life, and it's too late to remove it.
That's Martin Thiel. He might have a bit of a bold take on this, but he's not alone in thinking that at a certain point, plastic becomes part of the ecosystem.
Once we throw away plastic, it's not ours anymore. And other life absolutely colonizes that plastic. Some studies have shown that nearly 100 species can live on plastic and make that plastic their home. And so being careful about how we clean that plastic up is really important to protecting and preserving the ecosystem.
More research has actually come out about the garbage patch being teeming with life. And actually that coastal species are hitching a ride all the way to the garbage patch and then thriving there. Scientists have also found plastic-eating microbes that can turn polyethylene into CO2, although in small quantities.
All right.
That said, it's not a settled question yet. Some plastic leaches toxic chemicals. Some of it gets eaten by animals and contaminates the entire food chain. We don't fully understand the trade-offs between leaving plastic in ecosystems versus taking it out. Anyway, back to those photos. If the pictures we keep seeing are not of the garbage patch, what are they? The two most widely shared images of the patch are this one and this one. A photographer named Caroline Power took those up the coast of Honduras in 2017. So this particular crisis was actually close to land, not far out to sea.
In reality, the garbage patch is less polluted than many coastal zones.
Which might actually
coastal
be good
zones
news,
where the
because
people are.
researchers also think it's more effective to clean plastic from coastal areas than from garbage patches that are far out to sea. It's actually
See, this reminds me of the Bill Burr thing, and everybody always gives me a hard time because I kind of look like Bill Burr. But he was talking about how shark attacks were so high around beaches in these certain areas. Like, no expletive, I guess. That's where the people are. Yeah, that's where the people are. And all of these pictures of beaches and everything. Yeah, people are dumping illegally. It's getting into the ocean, and then it's being dumped back onto island beaches. Yeah. That's why it's way worse than the garbage patch, because all of the stuff keeps it's not going anywhere. It's just staying close to home.
Really interesting that the fervor over ocean plastic, the panic about it, started with the garbage patch, because the garbage patch is kind of this exceptional thing. It's mostly fishing gear. It's far out to sea. It's difficult to clean. And it's really not representative of the ocean plastic problem as a whole. Closer to shore, you see more of what you'd expect: water bottles, wrappers, all kinds of consumer packaging. But how it actually gets there is often misrepresented. When you Google, how does so much plastic end up in the ocean, the main result you find over and over again is littering.
True.
To show you what I mean, here's an educational video from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Where does marine debris come from? Marine debris comes from many different sources and enters the ocean in many ways.
So far.
Intentional littering and dumping are a big cause of marine debris. Sometimes the trash goes directly into the ocean, like when beachgoers don't pick up after themselves.
And there are other examples of this all over the internet. So this page, for example, it's called "How Does Plastic End Up in the Ocean?" And the number one reason it puts is that we're throwing plastic in the bin when it could be recycled. And number two is littering. Both of those are just not a majority of the problem here. This is the European Environment Agency, and it says poor waste management and careless littering on land are two of the main causes of the problem. Littering is responsible for a very small percentage of the overall plastic in the environment. Based on this graph from the OECD, you can see littering is this teeny tiny blue bar here, and mismanaged waste, not including littering, is this massive one at the bottom.
Mismanaged waste in this situation is really littering, because in this case, just look right here. This is a dump site, more than likely, near a beach in a third world country. And then you've got waste pickers going through there trying to find stuff. This is the kind of stuff that ends up in the ocean, and nobody talks about it. Everybody talks about Coca-Cola and PepsiCo being the largest plastic polluters. PepsiCo didn't do this. People did.
Mismanaged waste includes all the things that end up either in illegal dump sites or burned in the open or in the rivers or oceans or wherever. The focus on littering specifically, it's an easy answer because obviously there's nothing wrong with discouraging people from littering, but it focuses on individual people's bad choices rather than systemic forces that are basically flushing plastic into the ocean every minute. Mismanaged waste includes everything that escapes formal waste systems. So they might end up dumped, they might end up burned, they might end up in the environment. We're not even talking about landfills here. If it's landfill, that's managed waste. According to the OECD, 82% of macroplastic leakage into the environment, that's land, air, and sea, is the result of mismanaged waste. Putting so much emphasis on individual choices also takes the pressure off of the companies whose products so often become plastic waste. We know from beach cleanup data that Coca-Cola has been the #1 plastic polluter for 6 years in a row, producing 11% of all the branded plastic pollution found on beaches. And just 56 companies are responsible for half the world's branded plastic pollution. So I read Coca-Cola's sustainability report, and most of the emphasis for their solutions is on recycling. So is recycling the key to stopping plastic from getting in the ocean? Spoiler alert, no. But it's more complicated than you might think. We know at this point that big lies were told about recycling, and they were told because the plastics industry had a PR problem. In 1969, there was a quote from the American Chemical Society saying, "It is always possible that scientists and engineers will learn to recycle or dispose of waste at a profit, but that does not seem likely to happen soon on a broad basis." And boy, were they right. Globally, recycling rates are less than 10%, and they've been stuck that way for decades now.
Once again,
keep in mind, the
production.
amount of recycled plastic we make globally has quadrupled in 20 years. We're recycling more than ever. It just can't keep up. I think we need to show a graph here. So if you look at what goes into the ocean, items that actually have a chance of being recycled are hard plastics made of just one thing. This report calls them rigid monomaterials, but you can see they make up just 18% of plastic leakage into the ocean. These other two massive categories, they make up a vast majority of the plastic in the ocean, and those are just not widely recyclable items. You might hear people say that they're technically recyclable, the technology exists, but it's just not economically viable and it's not being done at a large scale. So the industry has known at this point that mixing together different types of plastics makes them unrecyclable. They've known it for more than 50 years, and they've just kept doing it. But either way, what we're looking at is less than a fifth of ocean plastic having even the potential to be recycled. So graphs like this really brought it home for me that this is one of the biggest lies about the ocean plastic problem, is that somehow we can recycle our way out of it, when such a tiny fraction of what's going into the ocean is even maybe recyclable. We need to talk about different ways to solve this problem.
All right,
Recycling
what are your
was
ways?
doomed to fail because it was given an impossible task. And the impossible task was just keep up with limitless plastic consumption. However, it's not exactly completely fake either. And that's something I'm encountering more and more in my everyday life when I talk to people about this. There's been so much coverage of recycling being a scam that people think it doesn't matter at all, that they shouldn't even try.
Yeah,
The reality
I've
is
been
that
saying that
headlines
for
saying
years.
recycling is a scam.
Like this, all these NGOs that are out there saying recycling is a fraud, it's a scam or whatever, then nobody freaking recycles because they're like, well, why am I going to do it? And look here, one of my best friends in all of the world, Judith Enck from Beyond Plastics, one of the biggest issues in this whole discussion. She's out here touting that recycling doesn't work and you shouldn't do it. And therefore, Gen Z recycles at the lowest rate of all generations. And then we wonder why we're in this situation. Yes, we still need to reduce consumption. We need new technologies. We need people like Brave and people like Madium that we discussed earlier to come through and resolve some of these issues with supply chain and making sure that there's a collaboration in the system to make it work. But we got to stop saying that plastic recycling doesn't work and will never work. This is stupid. Please
Totally
stop doing
fake,
this.
are misleading.
You know, it gets framed as an either or. Either we only need recycling and only recycling will fix this problem, or recycling won't fix this problem at all and we should absolutely give up on it. And I quite simply disagree. It is not an
Agreed with
either
that.
or. It is a yes and.
Agreed.
Yes, we need recycling and we need overall reduction.
One of the reasons recycling hasn't worked so well is because of low collection and sorting rates, and convincing people that it's totally fraudulent will just
Thank
make
you.
that problem worse.
Thank you.
So PET, plastic
I
number
like
one,
this lady.
and HDPE, plastic number two, are legitimately recyclable. Though the rates of plastic recycling for like all plastics is less than 10%, for those two
Once
plastics,
again,
it's closer to
that's
30%.
nameplate
And we
capacity.
could double that in the US by just doing a better job collecting plastics. We just need to stop thinking that recycling plastics gives us license to consume as much as we want.
True.
And stop accepting the industry line that is perfectly circular. It's meant to be a last resort for plastics we can't eliminate, and it still comes with some environmental trade-offs.
There is no hiding the fact that our recycling system is not working very well right now, but that doesn't mean we should give up on it.
True.
If anything, it
needs
means
to be
that
better.
we need to invest in it and make it
breakthrough
work.
technologies.
As you can see, this is messy. We want magic pills and silver bullets, a perfect solution for all these problems, and that's just not going to happen. And it's about to get messier because we need to talk more about microplastics.
Oh, this will be fun.
So microplastics are incredibly hard to wrap your head around. You see numbers in the billions and they're measured in terms of particles, and it's sort of impossible to envision what that even means or how bad it is. From Europe, so much microplastic goes into the environment that it's the equivalent of everyone in Europe throwing one grocery bag into the ocean each week. Then in the US, it's triple that number. Though microplastics are 11% of all the plastic that goes into the ocean each year, when you look at just high-income countries, that number goes up to 62%. Scientists keep finding them in new places, and then that makes the news, and now it's in the news cycle so much that it's almost become kind of a meme.
Yes.
With people joking about like microplastics for dinner and whatever you might see. So for a while, we were thinking maybe the main problem here was polyester and plastic clothing. But then we started having more data come out about tires. The tires on cars shed microplastics like crazy. Estimates vary, but tires can shed between 10 and 16% of their weight over their lifetime. That means each tire on a car loses a kilogram or 2 pounds of tire dust over its lifetime. We also know that the heavier a car is, the faster its tires wear down, which means the more microplastics go out into the environment. So that means like the big SUVs, Americans tend to drive really big cars. Those are creating higher numbers of microplastics. It's estimated that 9% of all plastic pollution going into the ocean is from tires. And right now there's just
Are we
no
going to
way
ban
of catching it.
tires?
So textiles remained a problem. Then we added tires to the list. But the craziest thing is that after that, a report came out that said that there was a new source of microplastics we hadn't been calculating correctly. And that if their math was right, it created more microplastics than all the other ones combined, more than tires and personal care products and clothing combined. And that source is paint. So according to this report, about 40% of paint ends up in the environment. And the craziest thing is that 37% of paint is plastic polymers. Like the composition of paint is plastic. We're painting our walls with plastic. When I heard that lots of microplastics came from paint, I had assumed it was mostly from ships. But actually marine sources were not even a majority of the microplastics that end up in the environment. And a lot of it is from buildings. About half the paint applied in European lower income countries will eventually leak to the environment. That is mind-boggling to me. All these things are basically modeled estimates. It's really difficult to measure microplastics, so people end up doing this sort of complex mathematic modeling to figure out how much paint gets shed off of these everyday objects. Even if this estimate is wrong and it's half that or a third of that, paint is still a huge source of microplastics in the environment that's been wildly underestimated. Ultimately, the disconcerting vibe that I get from all of this is that we know there are huge sources of microplastics out there, but we could discover a new one tomorrow that's even bigger. There are also a whole other type of microplastics that come from things already in the ocean breaking apart. A recent study found that the color of the plastic actually makes a big difference in terms of how fast that happens. So red, green, and blue plastics become microplastics much faster than white, silver, or black. Removing pigments from plastic would also make them much easier and more valuable for recyclers.
True.
But of course, mixing red caps and green bottles and all of that would mean brands giving up some of their brand power. So now we're getting to the really big questions. How do you compel massive institutions that benefit from plastic to change their ways?
Looking to add a Bitcoin fund to your portfolio? Do it with the Bitcoin Mini Fund from Grayscale.
Over the years, we've seen both governments and corporations make pledges to reduce their plastic footprints. Over 5 years, there was a 60% increase in these pledges, and in that same time...
Yeah, but I think the interesting part of this, so far, I give this, I have no idea who this person is, so I'm going to have to look that up. I give her a ton of credit. She's been very detailed. She's been pretty fair through this whole thing. Some of the stuff I don't like, but at the same time, I'm not going to like anti-plastics rhetoric, but I understand where that's coming from. But then, so the solution part of it, in the U.S., there's a big push to decarbonize. The previous administration was really big on that, was really pushing people to reduce carbon emissions. And packaging for these products can be a big source of emissions. So if you move from plastic to paper, or plastic to glass, or plastic to aluminum, you're going to increase your carbon footprint on all of those packages. So you've kind of got these competing interests out there where we want to decarbonize, but then we also want to get rid of plastics. So if you get rid of plastics, you're going to increase carbon emissions overall. So what are we trying to do here? Is it yes and, which, okay, if that's the case, what is a better solution than plastics? I've yet to hear anybody tell me and convince me of, all right, let's get rid of plastics, single-use plastics, and then we'll go with X. So if somebody can come to me and have a just basic conversation and convince me of this, then, I'll change my tune. But right now, I'm not seeing it.
Find a 50% increase in plastic pollution. That's not a 50% increase in 5 years. These pledges simply haven't worked. Plastic use is still set to triple by 2060. At this point, it might seem hopeless, but we're actually in a pivotal moment. In 2022, UN member states passed a resolution very ambitiously called End Plastic Pollution. For the past few years, they've been working on a global treaty. I've spoken to independent scientists who are at these negotiations, and they all talk about the same thing: reducing plastic production. This may seem painfully obvious, but we have to go through the data a bit because it's been weirdly controversial for a long time now to say that plastic production leads to more plastic pollution. If you map out plastic production since 1950, and map out the amount of plastic going into the ocean since that time, you get two lines that track each other very closely. And this is true even for individual brands. The 2024 study.
But I think there's something else that needs to be mentioned here. If you look at GDP growth, or if you look at just economic growth over that same time frame, those numbers are the same. So it's not like plastics is outstripping any kind of just consumer growth. It's just keeping up with demand. So it's like saying, hey, we live in a capitalist society, but we want you to not keep up with your demand. We want you to make less than what people want to buy from you. There's no industry in the world that's going to do that unless they're told they have to. And in this case, if they're told they have to, there's some serious trade-offs, and we need to make sure that both sides of that argument are being discussed.
Study found that the more product that Coke, Pepsi, Nestle, and other companies made, the more of their branded trash washed up on beaches. Even though making less plastic seems like a really clear answer, this idea is still tearing apart these negotiations.
There is a big group of countries supporting the obligations to reduce plastic production, but we also have a very small group of countries that are stalling progress in these obligations. And this small group of countries are the petrostates. People think that we are negotiating a waste treaty, but in reality, we are negotiating the future of fossil fuels.
The Center for International Environmental Law, where Daniela works, analyzed the guest list at these talks. They found petrochemical and fossil fuel industry lobbyists outnumbered scientists at these talks, sometimes 3-1. These industries are fighting hard because they're counting on plastics for their future growth.
The fossil fuel industry is using all types of tactics to intimidate and to harass. So as soon as we landed in Ottawa in April, we started to see billboards all over the city defending plastics. And with kids in a hospital with a mask of plastic for oxygen, which we are clear that we're not targeting this kind of elements with our ads for production reduction.
Inside the talks, industry reps don't want to talk about lowering production. They want to talk about recycling and waste management.
Of course, recycling is important, and we don't want to say that we don't need recycling. But if we want to make recycling something that actually works, we need to bring production to more sustainable levels. There's no way that recycling is going to keep up with the levels of production that we have today.
Every scientist and activist that I've spoken to about this issue wants two things: to reduce plastic production and to simplify the chemicals that go into plastics. There are about 16,000 chemicals used in plastics today, most of which are not regulated by international law. And getting that number lower could not only improve safety, but also make recycling much more effective. I don't know how this is all going to turn out or if plastic production is actually going to go down. But I do know Dow, a chemical company and one of the world's largest suppliers of the polymers that go into single-use plastics, seemingly doesn't have plans to slow down anytime soon.
Plastics right now, NFP, silicone, and coating. I think we have a pretty good line of sight. Since 2019, we've seen a 20% increase in volume in plastic. We think plastic is going to continue to see solid volumes, and we've got cost advantage from the long-term trends for plastic. Say the growth is going to continue to be there.
Of course. Yeah, there's cost advantages to plastics. Plastic's cheaper to make than paper, aluminum, glass. So that's the other thing. If we ban plastics, are we going to have even more inflation? I think people are pretty pissed about inflation already. That one was interesting. I actually really enjoyed watching that. And I thought it was, like I said a minute ago, relatively even-handed. And that's not typical for a lot of the videos I've watched so far.
Hey, I was supposed to jump out of this to kind of scare you, but it turns out that's funnier on paper than it is in practice. So I hope you don't mind too much. Fully, I got a lot of plastic here, and don't worry, I'm going to be putting it in a recycling bin because I'm not a sociopath or some kind of libertarian. But here's the thing. Most of this plastic will end up in a landfill or burned or in the ocean. And that's because most plastic
What the heck is this guy
not
wearing?
recyclable. Oh, but
That's
it's
not the
got
point
the
of this,
recycling symbol right on
But he's got
it.
like a romper on.
This is the recycling symbol created in 1970. And this is a resin identification code created by the plastics industry in 1988 to trick people into thinking plastic was recyclable and therefore may be okay for the environment. Plastic recycling is a lie to sell more plastic. I'm Raleigh Williams. climate science grad student, and guy who couldn't find a men's jumpsuit that fit him, but a women's jumpsuit is actually kind of working for me.
There we are.
And I hate to say this, but plastic recycling is an actual scam. Welcome to Climate Town.
Climate Town.
The beginning of the plastic recycling as a scam story starts with World War II. Do I have your attention now? Everybody's dad. Anyway, at the beginning of the most camera-ready war in history, the U.S. government felt that a flexible, lightweight material might really help our boys give the Jerry's the old piss and vinegar. So the government forced early plastics companies to work together, to crank out plastic, and to have little slumber parties where they shared their plastic-making secrets. And the modern plastic industry was born. Also, Brad totally has a crush on you.
God, no, he doesn't.
Yes, he does. He told me. He told me. Since plastic is made out of oil and natural gas, plastic companies sprang out of existing fossil fuel corporations and their hot cousins, the chemical industry. And the nightmare lobby industry group, the Society of the Plastics Industry, was born. And I'm pretty sure that's the last we'll be hearing of them in this video about how the plastic industry scammed America. Anyway, it was their job to get the American consumer, a group of people who had never really bought plastic, to start buying
seems like
a
the kind of guy
ton
I
of
wouldn't
plastic.
hang out with.
Lucky for them,
I'm just going to throw that
plastic
out
kicks ass.
Oh.
Plastic was lightweight, cheap, it performed better than other substances, and it had the ungodly power of the fossil fuel industry behind it. Basically, plastics blew through America like measles at an anti-vaxxer water park. But when Americans were saving their plastic to reuse it, lobby groups just bought advertisements telling them, throw it out every time, we'll just make more plastic out of our unlimited, consequence-free supply of fossil fuels. And that's when plastics came up against their first big hurdle.
On April 22nd, 1 in every 10 Americans took part in the public outcry on that first Earth Day led to political action.
Well, that actually wasn't going to work for the plastics industry, but they had a compromise they felt would work for everybody. They'd lie. So the plastics industry, fossil fuel corporations, and a number of other companies formed a front group called Keep America Beautiful. They got an Italian guy, dressed him up like a Native American stereotype, and then shot this commercial.
Some people have a deep, abiding respect for the natural beauty that was once this country.
Each of these videos
and some
exactly
people
the
don't.
same, just different people making it.
People
It
stop
almost seems like
pollution.
they're getting money
People
from
can
somebody.
stop it.
And they're getting a script,
yeah,
and they're putting it
they
together.
could have just easily made their products less disposable, but why do that when you can just spend a few $1 million on an advertisement to convince you it's your...
I think that's going to take me down a rabbit hole. I got to figure out where the money is coming for each of these things. So Climate Town, Beyond Plastics. My guess is Bloomberg has something to do with it, but we'll see.
Or fault there's more trash everywhere. And it worked for a while. See, the old depressed Italian maneuver got people to start throwing their trash in trash cans and even started some regional recycling programs. But when a louder call to end single-use items like plastic cropped up in 1987, the plastics industry decided it was time to take another trip to Scamville, where they were pleasantly surprised to find they were already the mayor. Okay, do you remember the Society of the Plastics Industry? Oh my God, they're back? Well, anyway, they genuinely did want recycling to work. So they looked into it in the 1980s and discovered, to their horror, that plastic can't really be recycled. The same chemical properties that make it moldable and flexible also make it degrade after 1 or 2 uses. I mean, that's not a recycle, that's a re-loop-de-loop. But even worse than any of that, recycling is...
All right, so paper's got the same problem. Paper breaks down after a while. So the fibers become shorter and shorter and shorter. So you have to downcycle paper as it goes along. Nothing is infinitely recyclable. I'm sorry, aluminum, that there's just no way that it's infinitely recyclable at 100%. And if somebody's got some stats or a study that shows me how that's wrong, please be my guest and send it my way. There's nothing that is just going to be recycled in perpetuity. So it's just
expensive and labor intensive, and making new plastic from fossil fuels is almost always cheaper forever.
It will always be
Plastic
cheaper.
Industry documents clearly concluded that there were no effective market mechanisms for mixed plastic, and that there is serious doubt that it can ever be made viable on an economic basis.
There was never an enthusiastic belief that recycling was ultimately going to work in a significant way.
I think they knew that the infrastructure wasn't there.
Yes.
To really have recycling amount to a whole lot.
But even though they knew
We need
recycling
infrastructure.
had zero chance
EPR
of
will do
stopping
that.
plastic from just fucking the world, they knew that if they could get people to believe recycling worked, they might have a chance
Why
of
has this
stopping
guy
an
got his
actual plastic
mic
ban.
taped to his
You know
chest
what?
with-
I'm being too cynical. We have like a relevant clip I could roll right here.
If the public thinks the recycling is working, then they're not going to be as concerned about the environment.
Well, that's not good.
Gotham.
But the old Society of the Plastics Industry had a plan. While most plastic could never be recycled, technically, some plastic could be recycled. So in 1988, they created a front group called the Council for Solid Waste Solutions, and they quietly lobbied nearly 40 states to pass legislation that required...
I'm relatively convinced now that there is some sort of a money group behind each of these videos, because they are quoting the same, it's the same script over and over and over again. It's the same news clippings. It's the same everything. It's almost like they have just been given the script to do for these things, and then they just run with it. And what I find interesting is when I talk to people outside of the industry, they'll tell me like, well, you know, all of this pro-plastics money lobby groups that are out there trying to just make more and more and more plastics. But really, there's a ton of anti-plastics money out there. There is a ton of anti-plastics money out there. And a lot of people watch YouTube and these kind of videos. And that is just exacerbating this idea that the plastics industry as a whole is trying to screw the world. And we're just hell-bent on destruction, where the weird old white guys sitting around the table deciding how we're going to steal from you, the American public, or you, the global public. We're not doing that. Every meeting that I'm sitting in, it's how do we make this better? How do we actually expand recycling? How do we make the world a better place? And once again, we suck at talking about why our products are good. And we are just terrible at marketing. This guy in his ladies' jumpsuit actually does a better job than the plastics industry in talking to consumers. He's some grad student. Who knows who the hell he is? He's got a YouTube channel. Who knows how many followers it has. But this is engaging. People pay attention to this. We need to do things that are engaging. We've got to get involved in this discussion, and we got to stop running from it. Because if we keep running from it, jumpsuit guy is going to be the one that's getting people's attention and driving the narrative. We have to stop that. It's driving me insane.
A symbol they created be printed on every single piece of plastic produced in America. Enter the resin identification code.
There's nothing wrong with that
Officially,
identification code.
just a way to say what type of
take off
plastic
the
the item
chasing
is
arrows
made
and
out
just
of.
put a
Now,
number one on
to
there.
be
I don't
clear,
care.
This is not a recycling symbol. See, the recycling symbol was public domain as of 1970. So the plastics industry just kind of borrowed it, stuck a number inside, and now it's a completely different symbol. What do you mean it looks like the recycling symbol? Don't you see the number inside? Of the 7 kinds of RICs, only 1s and 2s are commonly taken, and even they have a slim chance of
But you
actually
need to
being
check
recycled.
your local
But
system.
the plastics industry has made sure that every single piece of plastic has a recycle symbol on it, except no, they didn't, because that's not a recycle symbol. It's a resin identification code, because it's got a number.
If the public thinks the recycling is working, then they're not going to be as concerned about the environment.
So whenever the environmental movement would build up a head of steam, the plastic industry and fossil fuels would just pour millions of dollars into recycling campaigns until calls for plastic reduction died out. Then they just pull their funding and all the recycling initiatives collapse until it's time to promote recycling
plastic
again.
products. It's just, that's the other thing that drives me insane about this. People have choice. Anybody has the choice to buy any products they want. They can go get bottles, like actual glass bottles of Coca-Cola right now if they want to. They could get a soda stream. They can do any of the above, but they keep buying the plastic because that's what they want. And that's what they continue to buy. And they actually get pissed off in many cases when the plastic is removed for some other packaging. That's not always the case. Certain people are going to choose compostable. Great. Continue to choose compostable. They're going to choose paper because that's what they feel like is more sustainable. Okay. But the argument that plastics is doing all of this stuff to make it so people just assume that our products are recyclable is assuming that people actually give a shit. And I think we're finding out that most people really don't care about this. And I honestly think that's a problem. I think everybody in America should care about the environment. Every single person in America should care about their personal carbon footprint. They should care about where their waste goes. And they should be doing these things. But most people just don't. 43%. Once again, 43% of Americans that have access to recycling recycle because they don't care. And this guy is talking like every single person on the planet wants a clean environment. That's just not the case. And it drives me insane. I wish they did, but they don't.
For all the millions of dollars spent touting the wonders of recycling, only 10% has ever been recycled. Well, damn, Daniel, what are we going to do? Well, first of all, we got to stop treating recycle like it's the Beyonce in the Destiny's Child of reduce, reuse, recycle. Beyonce is reduce, reuse, and recycle is the other two. Second, we got to keep recycling. And I know, I just spent like 8 minutes shitting on recycling, but recyclers are the only people keeping that number at 10% and not 0%. In fact, any percent of a massive amount of plastic is still significant. And finally, we have to stop thinking about this like it's a problem we can solve with a quiet little choice at the grocery store. Legislation got us into this problem. Legislation's got to get us out. We got to pressure our governments to pass a ban on single-use plastics. How bad is the problem? Great question.
Once again, it's mind-boggling to me. Yes, people have choice. Everybody has the choice to buy these products. If you don't want more plastics, stop buying it. If you're so concerned about it, just stop. It's not that hard. It's really not that hard. You got options.
The plastic lobby has actually passed legislation preemptively banning plastic bans. That's right. It's a ban, and it's going to murder our planet if we can't get a hold of our legal system. It's going to take a group of people working together, so please, be one of those people. In the description of this video is a list of all the active plastic legislation and the groups behind it. If you have a second, and let's face it, you probably do have a...
Well, that's about all I can take today. Appreciate everybody for coming along on the ride with me on this one. If you would, leave some comments, let me know what you'd like to see in the future. Like I mentioned earlier, would love more people to go on and leave reviews on the podcast and subscribe, follow along, interact with me. Really appreciate it. But this has been the Redefining Plastics podcast yet again. My name's Justin Riney. Thank you very much and have a great night. If you want to learn more about the plastics industry, recycling, check out these other videos. Please like and subscribe.